They told him he was nobody. No degree, no institution, no name worth remembering. But the 17-year-old black boy standing at that podium didn't come to ask for permission. He came to destroy the most powerful man in science. Behind him, the answer no one could solve for 30 years. In front of him, the man who stole it. And he had no idea what was coming. It all started in a broken-down library on the south side of Chicago. The Harold Washington Public Library on South Halsted Street was never meant to be a sanctuary. It was a squat brick building with fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects and chairs held together with duct tape. Half the computers hadn't worked since the previous mayor's second term. The air conditioning broke every July and never got fixed before September. But for John Wright, it was the only place in the world where his mind could breathe. He walked there every morning 40 minutes through blocks where the sidewalks cracked like dried riverbeds and corner stores hid behind barred windows. He left the apartment before his mother woke, slipping past the kitchen where she'd left a plate of rice and whatever protein had been on sale that week, covered in plastic wrap with a napkin tucked underneath. John never understood why she always tucked a napkin. He never asked. John was 17. He lived with his mother Denise in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator hadn't worked in 3 years. Denise worked 2 jobs nights at a packaging plant in Cicero, days cleaning offices in a downtown high-rise where men in suits walked past her like she was part of the furniture. She left for her day shift before John came home from the library, and she left for her night shift after he'd already locked himself in his room. Most days, the only proof they still lived together was that plate of food on the counter. What Denise didn't know, what nobody in that neighborhood knew, was what John did inside that library. She thought he liked to read. That was the word she used when her coworker asked why her son spent so much time there. He likes to read. She said it the way someone might say their kid liked basketball or video games, something harmless, something normal. She had no idea that her son had taught himself calculus at 13 differential equations at 14 and number theory at 15, all from free online courses and textbooks he found in the library's donation bin. She had no idea that the boy who ate rice alone every night in a dark apartment was quietly becoming one of the most extraordinary mathematical minds of his generation. John didn't have friends, not because he was arrogant or hostile, but because he had never learned how to talk about things that didn't live inside his head. When kids on his block talked about the Bulls or the latest Drake album, John sat on the stoop and listened without speaking. He wasn't judging them. He simply couldn't find the door into their world. His brain operated on a frequency that no one around him could tune into, and that distance, that permanent invisible wall, made him lonelier than anyone who saw him walking those streets could have guessed. He looked like just another black kid in a hoodie. Nobody looked twice. The only thing that made John feel like he existed was solving problems. Not the kind teachers assigned in the underfunded public school. He'd mostly stopped attending those, bored him by 6th grade. The kind that lived in the margins of research papers, in the footnotes of graduate-level textbooks, in the unsolved conjectures that the world's best minds published and then walked away from. When John sat in front of the library's ancient desktop computer at 9 in the morning and didn't stand up until the librarian flickered the lights at closing time, he wasn't escaping his life. He was entering the only life that made sense to him. That was the world John lived in, small, invisible, and silent, when the Langford conjecture entered it. It started with a video, a recorded lecture from MIT uploaded to YouTube free for anyone with an internet connection. A professor named Richard Hargrove stood at a podium in a wood-paneled lecture hall and announced with the confidence of a man who had never been told no that he would dedicate the remainder of his career to solving one of the most stubborn problems in modern mathematics, a conjecture about the hidden structure of prime number distribution that had resisted every attempt at proof for 30 years. The Langford conjecture, named after the British mathematician who first proposed it in 1993 and died without solving it. Hargrove was 58, silver-haired, and carried himself like a man who had been photographed so many times he'd forgotten how to stand without posing. He was the most famous mathematician in America, not because he was the best, but because he was the most visible. He gave TED Talks. He wrote op-eds for the New York Times. He consulted for tech companies and hedge funds. His face had appeared on the cover of Time magazine under the headline, America's Beautiful Mind. When Hargrove announced his intention to crack the Langford conjecture, the media treated it like a moon landing. CNN ran a segment. Twitter trended. The scientific establishment collectively nodded and said, "If anyone can do it, it's him." John watched the lecture on a Tuesday afternoon in the library. He watched it once, then watched it again. Then he closed the browser, opened a notebook, and started writing. 3 weeks. That was all it took. 21 days of sitting in the same chair, filling 4 notebooks with equations so dense they looked like a foreign language, which in a way they were. A language only John spoke. He worked through the problem the way a river works through rock, not by force, but by finding the path no one else had seen. His approach was unconventional, almost alien to traditional methodology. Where established mathematicians had tried to brute force the conjecture with computational models and existing frameworks, John built a bridge from an entirely different direction, connecting number theory to geometric topology in a way that no published paper had ever attempted. On the 21st night, the power went out in the apartment. Rolling blackouts common in summer on the south side when the grid couldn't handle the load. John sat in the dark for a moment, then found a candle in the kitchen drawer, lit it, and kept writing. He finished the proof at 2:17 in the morning by candlelight on the last page of his 4th notebook. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call anyone. He sat there looking at what he'd done and felt something he couldn't name, not pride exactly, but a quiet recognition, like hearing his own voice for the first time. The next morning, John typed the proof into a post on an open mathematics forum, a platform similar to Archive but without institutional verification requirements. Anyone could post. He created an anonymous account, uploaded the solution, and submitted it at 7:43 in the morning. Then he walked home and went to sleep. 48 hours later, the internet broke. Mathematicians from Harvard, Oxford, Princeton, and the University of Tokyo independently verified the proof within 2 days. Not only was it correct, it was, in the words of one Cambridge professor, elegant to the point of being almost unbelievable. The method was so original, so unlike anything in the existing literature, that verification teams initially suspected it was generated by artificial intelligence. It wasn't. It was too human, too intuitive, too full of leaps that only a mind unbound by conventional training would make. The world wanted to know one thing: who posted it. The account was anonymous. No institutional affiliation, no email, no name. Richard Hargrove saw the proof before most of the world did. He was the first major figure to publicly confirm its validity, standing in front of cameras with the practiced grace of a man born for podiums. "This is a remarkable achievement for the field," he told reporters. "Whoever this individual is, they've given mathematics a gift." But behind the cameras inside his office on the 3rd floor of MIT's mathematics building, Hargrove sat alone with the door locked and his hands trembling. The problem he'd staked his legacy on, the conjecture he'd announced to the world he would solve, had been solved by a ghost. An anonymous stranger had done in 3 weeks what he couldn't do in 2 years of preliminary work. His reputation, his funding, his position at the center of the scientific universe, all of it suddenly felt like a house built on sand. That was when Hargrove made the decision that would change everything. He called his research assistant, a 26-year-old doctoral candidate named David Palmer. Palmer was sharp, reliable, and most importantly, desperate to keep his position. Hargrove gave him a single instruction: find out who posted the proof. Palmer traced the IP address to the Harold Washington Public Library on South Halsted Street, Chicago. He flew out the next day. It took him less than 4 hours. The librarian told him what he needed to know. There was a teenager who came in every single day, sat at the same computer, and stayed until closing. A quiet kid, always alone, always writing in notebooks. Palmer reported back to Hargrove, and Hargrove did something that no one, not Palmer, not the scientific community, not the world, would have predicted from a man of his stature. He didn't reach out to John. He didn't announce the discovery. He didn't do the right thing. Instead, Richard Hargrove took the proof, rewrote it, using his own notation and formatting style, and submitted it to the most prestigious mathematics journal in the world under his own name. Within 72 hours, the anonymous post on the open forum was quietly removed. Hargrove had the connections to make it disappear. Moderators received polite emails from MIT's legal department citing intellectual property concerns. The post vanished like it had never existed. 2 weeks later, Richard Hargrove stood on a stage at MIT holding a Crystal Award, smiling for photographers, accepting congratulations from colleagues who shook his hand and called him a genius. The headline in the Washington Post read, "MIT Professor Cracks 30-Year Math Mystery." Cable news ran the story for 3 days. Hargrove's face was everywhere. David Palmer stood in the back of that award ceremony with his arms crossed and a knot in his stomach that wouldn't go away. He knew. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew the proof belonged to a 17-year-old kid in Chicago who didn't even own a working laptop. But Palmer also knew what speaking up would cost him his PhD, his career, his future. So he clapped when everyone else clapped. And he said nothing. 600 miles away, in a dark apartment on the 4th floor of a building with no working elevator, John Wright sat on the edge of his bed and stared at a television screen. The screen showed a silver-haired white man in a tailored suit, holding a trophy, smiling at cameras, accepting credit for the proof John had written by candlelight on the last page of a notebook he'd bought for $2 at a thrift store. John didn't know the man's name. He didn't know how it had happened. He only knew one thing. The only achievement of his life, the only thing he had ever made that proved he existed, had been taken from him, and the world was celebrating the thief. He turned off the television. He sat in the dark, and something inside him, something that had always been fragile but holding, finally cracked. John didn't go to the library for 6 days after that night. He stayed in the apartment, sitting at the kitchen table or lying on his bed with his face to the wall. He didn't open his notebooks. He didn't turn on the television again. Denise noticed, of course she noticed. She saw the untouched plates of food the way her son's eyes had gone flat, like someone had reached inside him and switched off a light. She didn't know what had happened. She only knew that the boy who used to leave the apartment before sunrise now didn't leave at all. On the 3rd evening, she sat down across from him at the kitchen table before leaving for her night shift. She put her hand on his and said, "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." John looked at her hand on his. He didn't pull away, but he didn't answer either. Denise held on for a moment longer, then picked up her bag and walked to the door. She looked back once. He was still staring at the table. On the 7th day, John went back to the library. Not because the pain had faded, but because anger had replaced it. A quiet, focused anger that sat behind his ribs like a second heartbeat. He opened the forum where he'd posted the proof. His account was still active, but the post was gone. No trace, no cached version, nothing. He searched for it using every keyword he could think of. It had been scrubbed clean as if it had never existed. So John did the only thing he knew how to do. He rewrote the proof from memory, typed it into a new post, and uploaded it again, this time with a note at the top. "I am the original author of this solution. It was posted on this forum 11 days before the version credited to Dr. Richard Hargrove of MIT. The post stayed up for 9 hours before it was flagged and removed by moderators. The reason cited was unverified claim of authorship, potentially defamatory content. John tried again. He created a new account, he posted again, removed within 4 hours, he created a third account, removed within 2. Someone or something was watching. He switched tactics. He found the email addresses of mathematics departments at 5 major universities: Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, the University of Chicago, and Caltech. He wrote a careful, detailed email explaining who he was, what he had done, and how the proof had been taken. He attached photographs of his handwritten notebooks, time-stamped with dates that preceded Hargrove's submission by nearly 3 weeks. He sent the emails on a Tuesday morning and refreshed his inbox every 15 minutes for the rest of the day. By Friday, he had received one reply. A single line from an administrative assistant at Columbia: "If you're going to impersonate a scholar, at least use proper formatting." Nobody else responded. Not one. John sat in front of the library computer and read that sentence 4 times. He understood something then, something he had always known in the abstract but had never felt in his body. In this world, truth was not enough. Truth without a name, without a title, without a face. The world recognized truth from a 17-year-old black kid with no institution, no credential, no advocate that truth didn't exist. It wasn't that people didn't believe him. It was worse than that. They never even considered the possibility that he might be telling the truth. He was invisible before he opened his mouth. At home, the silence between John and Denise grew heavier. He stopped eating most of what she left for him. He sat by the window for hours, watching the street below without seeing it. Denise would come home between shifts, find him in the same chair, and feel a helplessness she couldn't name. She didn't know about the proof. She didn't know about Hargrove. She only knew her son was disappearing in front of her, and she had no idea how to reach him. 3 weeks passed like that. John stopped going to the library. He stopped writing in his notebooks. The anger that had driven him back after those first 6 days had burned itself out. And what remained was something colder, a resignation that settled over him like dust on abandoned furniture. He was 17 years old, and he had already learned the lesson that the world teaches people like him first. And hardest you can be right, and it won't matter. Then James Whitfield walked into his life. Whitfield was 62 years old, a mathematics professor at a small university outside Boston that most people had never heard of. He was black-gray-bearded and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world would never give him what he deserved. 40 years earlier, Whitfield had been a prodigy, a kid from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, who could see patterns in numbers the way some people see shapes in clouds. He'd earned a scholarship to Princeton, published 2 papers before finishing his doctorate, and was on track to become one of the most important mathematicians of his generation. Then the track disappeared. Funding was redirected. Mentors retired or moved on. Colleagues who published less but looked more like what the Academy expected somehow always got the positions, the grants, the invitations. Whitfield ended up at a teaching-focused college where his research budget was smaller than what MIT spent on coffee. He wasn't bitter, but he carried a weight that never fully lifted the knowledge of what might have been if the door had stayed open. Whitfield had seen John's original post, not the rewritten versions that kept getting taken down the first one. The one John had uploaded at 7:43 in the morning 6 months ago. Whitfield had been browsing the forum that day, as he often did, and the proof had caught his attention immediately. Not just because it was correct, because the method was extraordinary, the same geometric topological bridge that no one in the mainstream literature had ever attempted. Whitfield had downloaded a copy before going to bed that night. When the post disappeared the next day, he thought it was a glitch. When Hargrove published the same proof under his own name 2 weeks later, Whitfield felt something cold move through his chest. He didn't act immediately. He spent weeks comparing the 2 versions, the anonymous post he'd saved and Hargrove's published paper. The mathematics were identical. The method was the same. But the notation was different. Hargrove had rewritten the proof in his own style, the way a student might copy an essay and change the font. And there was one detail that sealed it: the anonymous post had been uploaded 11 days before Hargrove's submission to the journal. Whitfield had the timestamp. He could have gone public. He could have contacted the journal, filed a complaint, raised the alarm. But Whitfield knew how the system worked. He was a 62-year-old black professor at a school nobody respected, accusing the most famous mathematician in America of theft. Without the original author standing beside him, it would be his word against Hargrove's empire. So he did something else. He went to Chicago. It took Whitfield 2 days to find John. He went to the library on South Halsted Street, spoke to the same librarian David Palmer had spoken to months earlier, and waited. John didn't show up. Whitfield came back the next morning and waited again. At 11:15, John walked through the door, not with the purposeful stride of someone coming to work, but with the aimless drift of someone who had nowhere else to go. He sat down at his usual computer, opened a browser, and stared at the screen without typing. Whitfield sat down in the chair beside him. John didn't look up. Whitfield placed a printed copy of the anonymous forum post on the desk between them, the post John had written, the one the world had erased. John looked at it. Then he looked at Whitfield. "The Langford conjecture," Whitfield said. "The method you use, the topological bridge into the prime structure. I've never seen anything like it. I need to know how you arrived at it." John studied the old man's face. He had spent weeks being ignored, dismissed, and erased. Every instinct told him to say nothing. But something in Whitfield's eyes, a recognition not of genius, but of pain, made him answer. He talked for 20 minutes. Not about the theft, not about Hargrove. About the math. He explained the path his mind had taken through the problem, the dead ends, the breakthroughs, the moment at 2 a.m. by candlelight when the final piece fell into place. Whitfield listened without interrupting. When John finished, the old professor leaned back in his chair and exhaled like a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected for a long time. "Hargrove didn't solve this," Whitfield said. It wasn't a question. John shook his head. Whitfield told John his own story, then not all of it, but enough. The scholarship, the early promise, the doors that closed one by one, not with a slam, but with a quiet click. He told John about the years of teaching introductory courses to students who didn't care while watching men with half his talent collect awards he would never be nominated for. He said, "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because 40 years ago I had a choice. Someone took something from me, not a proof, but an opportunity. And I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself the work was what mattered, not the credit." Whitfield looked directly at John. "I was wrong. And I've spent every day since then wondering what would have happened if I'd had the courage to stand up." He placed a folder on the desk. Inside were printouts, the saved forum post, with its timestamp Hargrove's published paper, with its submission date, and a side-by-side comparison of the two. 11 days apart. Identical methods. Different names. "You have the evidence," Whitfield said. "You have the truth. The question is whether you're willing to fight for it." John took the folder. He didn't answer, but he didn't say no. The next 4 weeks were the most focused of John's life. With Whitfield's guidance, he began building a case, not a legal case, but an evidentiary one. He gathered everything, the 4 handwritten notebooks, filled with his work library access logs that showed his daily presence during the 3 weeks he'd spent solving the conjecture, the metadata from his anonymous account showing the exact upload time, and Whitfield's saved copy of the original post with its unaltered timestamp. Whitfield used his academic contacts, modest as they were, to request a formal review from MIT's mathematics department. He wrote a letter to the department chair outlining the timeline discrepancy and requesting that Hargrove's paper be examined for potential authorship concerns. The letter reached Hargrove's desk within 48 hours, and that was when the counterattack began. Hargrove moved with the precision of a man who had spent decades navigating institutional power. His first call was to the dean of Whitfield's University. Within a week, Whitfield received a formal notice that his department's research funding, already thin, was under review due to budgetary restructuring. No one said Hargrove's name. No one had to. His second move was legal. John received a certified letter at his apartment, the first piece of mail he'd ever gotten that wasn't junk. It was from a law firm in Boston representing Dr. Richard Hargrove, and it informed John that any further public claims of authorship regarding the Langford conjecture solution would be considered defamatory and would result in civil litigation. The letter used words like actionable damages and full extent of the law. John read it sitting on the floor of his bedroom. He was 17 years old. He had never spoken to a lawyer in his life. Hargrove's third move was the most calculated. He appeared on a nationally televised interview, calm, measured, wearing the same gentle smile he'd perfected over 30 years of public appearances. When the host asked about rumors circulating online regarding the proof's authorship, Hargrove shook his head with an expression of practiced sadness. "It's unfortunate," he said. "In the age of social media, anyone can make a claim. I feel sympathy for whoever is behind this, but the work speaks for itself, and I stand behind it completely." He never mentioned John by name. He didn't have to. The implication was clear. A nameless nobody was trying to steal credit from a great man. In Chicago, the ripple effects hit John where he was most vulnerable. Someone on social media connected the anonymous forum posts to the South Side Library. Comments appeared online, not many, but enough. A neighbor asked Denise at the laundromat if her son was in some kind of trouble. Denise's supervisor at the office building where she cleaned pulled her aside and asked with poorly disguised suspicion whether there was anything going on at home that the company should know about. Denise said no. She said it firmly. But when she came home that night, John saw something in her face he had never seen before: fear. Not for herself. For him. That same week, something unexpected happened. John received an email from an address he didn't recognize. No subject line. One sentence: "I know the truth, but I'm not ready yet." No signature. No name. John stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't know who sent it. But somewhere, in a way he couldn't explain, the message made him feel less alone. Someone else knew. Someone on the other side of this wall had seen what Hargrove had done. The word proof had taken on a meaning beyond mathematics. But the damage was already spreading faster than John could contain it. Hargrove's legal threat hung over the apartment like a storm cloud. John had no money, no lawyer, no institution behind him. Whitfield's University was buckling under pressure. Two of his colleagues had already been told their contracts wouldn't be renewed the following year, and everyone knew why without anyone saying it out loud. The system was doing what systems do, protecting the powerful by making the powerless too expensive to support. Then came the thing that broke John. A report was filed with the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. Anonymous. It alleged that Denise Wright was failing to provide adequate supervision for her minor child, citing John's chronic school absences and erratic behavior. A caseworker showed up at the apartment on a Thursday afternoon, clipboard in hand, asking questions about Denise's work schedule, John's education, the condition of the home. John stood in the hallway and watched his mother sit across from a stranger at their kitchen table, the same table where she left his dinner every night, always covered, always with a napkin tucked underneath, and answer questions about whether she was a fit parent. Denise answered every question calmly, with the composure of a woman who had spent her entire life being evaluated by people who didn't know her. But John saw her hands. They were trembling, not from fear, from the humiliation of having to prove in her own home that she was good enough to raise the son she had sacrificed everything for. That night, after the caseworker left, John locked himself in his room and cried. Not with sound. John never cried with sound. He pressed his face into the pillow and shook. He cried because his mother's hands had trembled. He cried because the woman who had never complained, never asked for anything, never once made him feel like a burden, was now paying the price for his fight. He cried because he understood with terrible clarity that his pursuit of justice was destroying the only person who had ever loved him without conditions. The next morning, John called Whitfield. His voice was flat, emptied of everything. "I'm done," he said. "It's not worth what it's costing her." Whitfield was quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of 40 years of regret. "If you stop now, John, no one will blame you. Not me, not your mother, not anyone who knows what you're up against." He took a breath. "But I want you to understand something. Walking away doesn't mean the pain stops. It means you carry it, every day, for the rest of your life. I know because I've been carrying mine for 40 years. John hung up. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the 4 notebooks stacked on his desk, the ones filled with the proof, with the work, with the only thing he'd ever made that proved he was real. He picked them up. He held them against his chest, and he stayed like that, motionless, as the morning light moved slowly across the floor of his room. 3 days passed. John didn't call Whitfield again. He didn't go to the library. He moved through the apartment like a ghost, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, doing small things with his hands so his mind wouldn't eat him alive. He put the 4 notebooks in the bottom drawer of his desk and closed it. He told himself that was the end. On the 4th morning, Denise didn't leave for her day shift. John found her sitting at the kitchen table when he came out of his room, still in her house clothes, coffee untouched in front of her. This had never happened before. Denise didn't miss work. Denise didn't sit still during daylight hours. Something in the apartment shifted like the air pressure before a storm. She told him to sit down. He did. Denise didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask about the caseworker, the proof, or the man on television. Instead, she told John something she had never told anyone. When she was 19, a counselor at her community college had pulled her aside and told her she qualified for a transfer scholarship to a 4-year university downstate. Full tuition, books, housing, everything. All she had to do was apply. Denise filled out half the application and stopped. She told herself she wasn't smart enough. She told herself she'd fail, that she didn't belong in a place like that. She told herself it was better to stay where she was, cleaning houses, working shifts, living small, than to reach for something and have the world slap her hand away. She looked at John across the kitchen table, and her voice was steady, even though her eyes were not. "I don't understand your math," she said. "I don't know what they took from you, but I know what it feels like to let fear make your decisions, and I know what it costs. I've been paying for it my whole life." She put both hands flat on the table. "I don't want you to live the life I lived, John. Not because there's anything wrong with my life, but because you have a door open that I didn't walk through. And if you close it now, you'll spend the rest of yours wondering." John sat there for a long time after she finished. He looked at his mother's hands on the table, the same hands that covered his plate every night, that trembled in front of the caseworker but never in front of him. He understood something then. Walking away wasn't protecting her. Walking away was becoming her, not in the way she lived, which was brave and dignified, but in the one regret she carried. The things she gave up. The door she never walked through. If he quit now, he would carry the same weight she carried, and she would watch him carry it, knowing she couldn't stop it the same way she watched him now. He went to his room. He opened the bottom drawer. He took out the 4 notebooks. That evening, John walked back to the library for the first time in over a week. He sat down at the same computer he'd used since he was 13 years old, opened his email, and composed a reply to the anonymous message he'd received weeks earlier, the one that said, "I know the truth, but I'm not ready yet." He kept his response short. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He wrote, "I'm not asking you to stand with me. I'm asking you to stand with the truth. That's all." He sent it and walked home. He didn't expect a response. David Palmer replied in 14 hours. The message was longer this time, raw, unpolished, written by someone whose hands were shaking as they typed. Palmer explained who he was. He explained that he'd been the one who traced the IP address to the library. He explained that he had watched Hargrove rewrite the proof submitted and accept the award, and that he had said nothing because he was afraid. He was still afraid. But he couldn't sleep anymore. He couldn't look at his own research without feeling sick. He wrote, "I've spent 6 months pretending I didn't see what I saw. I can't do it anymore." Palmer offered John everything he had, the internal MIT server logs showing when Hargrove first accessed the anonymous forum post, the email chain, where Hargrove instructed the forum moderators to remove it, and the edit history of Hargrove's paper, showing that the first draft was created 2 days after John's post appeared. Digital fingerprints that Hargrove had been too arrogant to erase because he never imagined anyone would look. John called Whitfield. When the old professor answered, John said just 3 words, "I'm not done." The plan came together over the next 2 weeks. Whitfield had spent 40 years in academia without accumulating power, but he had accumulated something more useful, quiet relationships with honest people. One of those people was Dr. Helen Marsh, a retired professor from Oxford, who sat on the organizing committee of the International Congress of Mathematics, a major conference that brought together the most respected minds in the field. This year's Congress was being held in Boston, and this year Richard Hargrove was scheduled to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award on the conference's final evening. Whitfield called Helen Marsh and asked for one thing, a 15-minute speaking slot, on the final day registered under his own name, listed simply as a presentation on extensions of the Langford conjecture. The topic was legitimate. The request was modest. Marsh approved it without suspicion. John didn't prepare a speech. He didn't prepare an accusation or a dramatic reveal. He prepared something far more devastating. He prepared mathematics. Working from the library during the day and at the kitchen table with the second-hand laptop Whitfield had lent him at night, John solved what no one had attempted, an extension of the Langford conjecture into higher-dimensional prime structures. A problem that could only be solved by someone who had built the original method from the ground up, who understood not just the proof, but the intuition behind it. The thing Hargrove had copied but never comprehended. If John could solve the extension live in front of the world's best mathematicians, using the same method that appeared in the anonymous post, the conclusion would be inescapable. No speech necessary. No accusation required. The math would speak. The International Congress of Mathematics filled a 1,200-seat auditorium at Boston University. On the final afternoon, the room was packed. Richard Hargrove sat in the front row wearing a charcoal suit and a silk tie, already rehearsing his acceptance remarks in his head. He had not seen the program closely enough to notice a 15-minute presentation by a professor from a school he'd never heard of. When John Wright walked onto the stage, Hargrove's expression didn't change immediately. He didn't recognize the boy. Why would he? He had never met John. He had only stolen from him. John stood behind the podium. He was 17 years old, wearing a white shirt Denise had ironed that morning and shoes she'd bought at a thrift store for $12. He looked out at 1,200 of the most accomplished scientists on Earth and felt his heart hammering against his chest. But his hands were steady. His voice when he spoke was clear. "My name is John Wright. I'd like to present an extension of the Langford conjecture into higher dimensional prime structures." He turned to the whiteboard, and he began to write. For 12 minutes, John worked through the extension by hand in real time, in front of every camera and every eye in that auditorium. The method he used was unmistakable. It was the same topological bridge that had appeared in the anonymous forum post 6 months earlier, the same method Hargrove had copied into his published paper without understanding its origin. But John didn't just reproduce it, he extended it. He pushed it further than the original proof had gone into territory that required the kind of deep intuitive understanding that only the creator of a method could possess. Every line he wrote was a sentence in a language he had invented, and everyone in that room could see it. When he wrote the final equation and set down the marker, the auditorium was silent. 1,200 people motionless. Then a voice rose from the middle rows, an Oxford professor who had been part of the original verification team 6 months ago. "The method," she said loud enough for the room to hear. "It's identical to the anonymous post, the one that was removed." Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Eyes moved from John to the front row where Richard Hargrove sat with his face drained of color. Then David Palmer stood up. He was sitting in the 5th row, close enough to the stage that John could see his hands shaking. Palmer's voice cracked on the first word, but he steadied himself and spoke clearly. "My name is David Palmer. I was Dr. Hargrove's research assistant at MIT. 6 months ago, Dr. Hargrove instructed me to trace the IP address of the anonymous post that solved the Langford conjecture. I traced it to a public library in Chicago. Dr. Hargrove then took the proof, rewrote it under his own name, and submitted it as his own work. I have the server logs, the email correspondence, and the edit history to prove it." Palmer reached into his bag and held up a folder. The same kind of folder Whitfield had placed on a library desk in Chicago months ago. Evidence, timestamps, the truth printed on paper. Hargrove did not stand. He did not speak. The man who had filled lecture halls, charmed television hosts, and commanded the respect of an entire field sat in his chair and stared straight ahead, jaw-locked hands gripping the armrests exactly as he'd been sitting when this story began. The aftermath unfolded without spectacle. MIT opened a formal investigation within 72 hours. Hargrove was suspended, then quietly stripped of his title. The Journal retracted his paper. No press conference, no public apology. Just a brief statement on the university's website, and then silence, the kind of silence that institutions use to bury their mistakes. Hargrove's name, once synonymous with brilliance, became the thing colleagues mentioned only in whispers, the way people talk about a building that burned down. David Palmer left MIT before the investigation concluded. He was accepted into a doctoral program at the University of Michigan, working under a professor who had watched his testimony at the Congress and called him the next day. Palmer never spoke publicly about Hargrove again. He didn't need to. What he had done in that auditorium, standing up shaking, telling the truth when it cost him everything he'd built, was the only statement that mattered. Whitfield retired 3 weeks after the conference. He and John spoke on the phone the evening before he cleaned out his office. Whitfield's voice was tired, but lighter than John had ever heard it. 40 years ago, I didn't have the courage, Whitfield said. You had it for both of us. John did not go to MIT. He did not accept the interview requests, the podcast invitations, or the offers from institutions that suddenly wanted to claim him. He accepted a full scholarship to the small university outside Boston, where Whitfield had spent his career, the school nobody had heard of, with the modest campus and the underfunded math department. He chose it because it was the place where someone had first looked at him and seen a person, not a headline. The week before he left Chicago, John sat at the kitchen table with Denise. She had made rice and chicken, the same meal she'd been leaving on that table for years, always covered, always with a napkin tucked underneath. But tonight, they ate together. Neither of them spoke. The television was off. The apartment was quiet, and the silence between them wasn't distance anymore. It was understanding, the kind that doesn't need words because the words have already been lived. When John picked up his bag and walked to the door the next morning, Denise stood in the kitchen doorway. She watched him tie his shoes, check his pockets, and reach for the handle. Then she said something she had never said before. "I'm proud of you." John didn't turn around, but his shoulders trembled just once before he opened the door and stepped into the morning light. The world would call him a genius. They would argue about his IQ, whether it was 900 or 400 or some number that no test could capture. They would write articles and make documentaries and debate what made his mind different. But the hardest thing John Wright ever did had nothing to do with mathematics. It wasn't solving a problem that had stumped the world for 30 years. It wasn't standing on a stage in front of 1,200 strangers and proving who he was. It was learning to believe he was worth fighting for. And maybe that's the thing worth remembering. Not the equations, not the IQ score, not the awards or the headlines, but the fact that somewhere out there right now, there's someone sitting in a room alone, holding something extraordinary inside them, wondering if the world will ever let them show it. Maybe the answer isn't waiting for permission. Maybe it never was. If this story stayed with you, if John's journey made you feel something, I'd love to hear which moment hit you the hardest. Drop it in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who's been told they're not enough, send this to them. Sometimes a story finds the right person at the right time. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you there.